They claimed authority over my 500-acre timberland, my trees. 500 acres of old-growth Douglas fir that my great-great-grandfather planted his boots into before the state of Oregon had paved a single road. Land that my family has worked, bled on, and buried people next to for 140 years. And some homeowners association, formed 11 months ago by a developer who scraped 40 cookie-cutter lots out of a corner pasture, was threatening me with $200 a day in fines unless I trimmed my ornamental foliage to match the neighborhood aesthetic. She drove up to my gate in a white Escalade, looked me dead in the eye, and said,
"You have 30 days to comply, or we fine you $200 a day."
11 months in this county. My hands were shaking when she left. She had no idea what that mistake was going to cost her. What would you do? Drop it in the comments. And where are you watching from? Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what I did. My name is Garrett Caldwell. I'm 53 years old. I've been working this land since I was 14, felling timber, running a chainsaw, hauling logs down roads my grandfather graded with a bulldozer he bought secondhand in 1961. I didn't go to college. I don't own a suit. On a good day I smell like pine pitch and diesel, and I consider that a compliment. The Caldwell Timber Tract is 512 acres of working timberland in the foothills of eastern Oregon, in a county called Harlan. We have a creek that runs steelhead in the spring. We have a ridge where, on a clear November morning, you can see 3 mountain peaks at the same time. We have a barn my great-grandfather built in 1889 that still stands, east wall leaning a little, like it's tired, but standing. The nearest traffic light is 11 miles away. I manage the land under a sustainable yield rotation, cutting sections in sequence so the forest regenerates naturally, the creek stays clean, and the operation stays profitable. I have timber contracts with 2 regional mills. I have a conservation easement with the County Land Trust on the riparian buffer along the creek. I have a state-certified forest management plan, filed with the Oregon Department of Forestry. I know what I'm doing. I've been doing it my whole life. My great-great-grandfather Elias Caldwell filed the original land claim on this property in 1884. He broke the ground with a mule named Pete and a crosscut saw. He built the first cabin with his own hands. He is buried on the northeast corner of the property, under a white oak tree, next to his wife and 2 of their children, who didn't survive their first winter. 3 more generations followed him into that soil before my time. This is not just land to me. This is everything. Then, in 2021, a man named Dwight Pruitt arrived from Portland. Pruitt was a developer, the kind who wears expensive boots that have never touched actual mud, and talks about community vision and integrated living environments, which is developer speak for cramming as many houses as possible onto land that used to breathe. He bought 38 acres from my elderly neighbor, Walt Hennessy, who was 91 and whose kids had been after him to sell for years. Walt got a fair price. I didn't begrudge him that. What I begrudged was what came next. Pruitt filed the plat for Cascade Ridge Estates, 41 lots, a clubhouse the size of a double-wide, and a landscaping covenant written by a Portland attorney who'd never set foot in Harlan County. And buried in that covenant, in Section 14, subsection C, in font that required a magnifying glass, was a clause that said, "All properties contiguous or adjacent to Cascade Ridge Estates, whose legal descriptions share a boundary line of 50 feet or more with any platted lot, are hereby included in the HOA jurisdiction for the purposes of aesthetic compliance and common area maintenance assessments." In plain English, if your fence touched their subdivision, they owned your curb appeal. My south pasture shared 400 feet of fence line with the new development's northern boundary. Under Pruitt's creative legal draftsmanship, that made my 500-acre timber operation subject to HOA rules. The woman who showed up at my gate was Vonda Pruitt, the developer's wife. She had appointed herself HOA president. No election, no vote, just appointed. And she had driven out to my property on a Tuesday morning in April to deliver the news personally. I remember the sound of her tires on my gravel, that slow, careful crunch of someone who doesn't know a dirt road taking the curve too cautiously. I was on the porch with my coffee, watching the fog lift off the ridge when she pulled up. She didn't get out of the Escalade at first. She sat there looking at my land through the windshield. Then she rolled down her window. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "we need to talk about your property." I set down my coffee. I walked to the gate. And I listened to her tell me that my family's timber operation was an aesthetic violation. My hands were shaking when she left, but my mind was already working. The first thing I did was nothing. Strategically, deliberately, beautifully nothing. I let the 30 days lapse. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't call. I didn't send a certified reply. I went about my life. Got up at 5, ran the chainsaw, hauled timber, came home smelling like a Christmas tree. The smell of fresh-cut Douglas fir in October is something between pine sap and cedar, sharp and sweet at the same time. And I wore it every day while Vonda Pruitt was presumably refreshing her email, waiting for my response. On day 31, a second letter arrived. Fine invoice for $200. I filed it in a manila folder I had already labeled, with some foresight, HOA nonsense. On day 45, Vonda drove back out. I watched her Escalade navigate my gravel road from the kitchen window. She parked at the gate. She didn't get out. She took photographs through the windshield. She drove away. The next letter included those photographs, and a citation notice listing 11 separate violations. Among them, uncertified wood storage structures visible from community sightlines. That's my barn, the one that's been standing since before her grandparents were born. Unmanaged forest encroachment. That's my trees. And my personal favorite, non-standardized boundary marking devices. That's my fence. A fence made of post and wire that has marked this property since 1974. Total fines claimed, $1,400. Now here's where I made my first smart move, and it's one worth writing down. I called my cousin Delia, who was a paralegal in Eugene. She'd never worked HOA law specifically, but she knew how to read a document. I mailed her the original Cascade Ridge Estates CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, all 47 pages, along with the county property records, my forest management plan, and the conservation easement on the riparian buffer. 3 days later, Delia called me back. She was laughing. "Garrett," she said, "I don't think they know what an easement is. Here's the first legal trick, and it's a good one. A conservation easement is a legally recorded encumbrance on a property that restricts certain uses of the land. It's filed with the county recorder. It's a real property interest that exists independent of whoever owns the land. When Pruitt's attorney drafted that CC&R clause, claiming jurisdiction over adjacent properties, they almost certainly didn't run a title search thorough enough to catch that my riparian buffer, including the section of fence line that abutted the subdivision, was covered by an easement held by the Harlan County Land Trust. A land trust with its own legal standing and its very own opinion about what an HOA could do with land it held in easement. Always check whether an existing easement on your property immunizes that portion from a new encumbrance. A conservation easement recorded before an HOA's formation is senior to the HOA's claims. Delia also found that Oregon Revised Statute 94.630 governs HOA authority, and it is clear that an HOA's CC&Rs bind owners of lots within the recorded plat, not neighboring landowners, not farmers across a fence, lots within the plat. Vonda's creative, adjacent properties language. It wasn't going to hold up, but I wasn't in a hurry. I'd watched trees grow for 30 years. I understood that the best timber sometimes comes from the tree you let stand the longest. I knew Vonda and Dwight were going to keep pushing, and every time they pushed, they were going to leave a mark on themselves. So I paid a $75 fee to pull the full corporate records on the Cascade Ridge HOA from the Oregon Secretary of State's office. And I paid another $25 to pull Dwight Pruitt's Development LLC filings. I printed everything out, hole-punched it, put it in a 3-ring binder, and set it on the kitchen table next to the manila folder labeled HOA Nonsense. That binder was going to get very full. The fines kept coming. By the end of month 2, the claim total was $7,600. I put each invoice in the folder and went back to running my timber operation. The ridge smelled like rain and loam that week, that dark, wet earth scent that means the soil is alive and working. And I breathed it in every morning like a man who knew exactly where he stood. Because I did know, and Vonda Pruitt did not. Month 3 is when things got interesting. The Cascade Ridge HOA held its monthly meeting in the clubhouse, a beige structure that smelled aggressively of new carpet and someone's notion of upscale living. About 14 homeowners showed up, plus Vonda presiding, plus 2 other board members she had personally appointed, a retired insurance adjuster named Rutherford Gaines, and a woman named Paige Dunmore, who had moved from Portland 18 months ago, and who brought the energy of someone who had just discovered the word governance. Vonda informed the assembled homeowners that my property was creating a significant aesthetic liability for property values, and that the board was exploring enforcement mechanisms. One homeowner, a quiet man named Ellis Brewster who ran a feed store in town, raised his hand. "Isn't that land a working timber operation? Don't they have some kind of state license?" "That's being looked into," Vonda said, which in HOA speak means, "I have not looked into this and don't plan to." 2 days later, a man showed up at my gate, not Vonda this time, a man in khaki pants and a Cascade Ridge HOA polo shirt, who identified himself as the Community Standards Enforcement Officer. His business card said, Brandon, just Brandon, no last name. Brandon informed me that he was there to conduct a compliance inspection of the property boundary. I looked at him for a long moment. The wind was coming off the ridge, carrying the smell of a distant chainsaw and the faint sweetness of fir pitch. I looked at his clean shoes. I looked at the clipboard. I looked back at his face. "You got a warrant?" I asked. This is a civil matter, sir. I just need to." "You're not a law enforcement officer." "No, but the HOA has no authority over my land," I said. "You're standing at my gate, which is on my property. You have 30 seconds to turn around before I call the sheriff." Brandon turned around in about 10. Here's legal trick number 2, and it applies nationwide. A homeowners association compliance officer has exactly as much authority to enter private property as any other private citizen, which is none, without permission or a court order. HOA enforcement officers operate entirely at the discretion of the property owner. If someone in a polo shirt shows up claiming authority to inspect your land, you are under no legal obligation to let them in. Point at the gate. Repeat as necessary. An HOA has no police powers. Compliance inspections on private property require either your consent or a court order. Full stop. Vonda's next move was her most sophisticated. She went to the Harlan County Zoning Board and filed a formal complaint alleging that my timber operation was incompatible with the surrounding residential use and requesting a zoning review. If she could get the zoning board to restrict the timber operation, she could use that as leverage. What Vonda did not know, what she really, genuinely had not looked up, was that my property was enrolled in Oregon's forest land classification under ORS Chapter 321. That designation carried a suite of protections against zoning changes that would interfere with the commercial use of the land for forest operations. You cannot zone a working timber forest out of existence because a subdivision moved in next door. The legal term for this protection is right to practice forestry, and Oregon takes it seriously. I got the zoning complaint notice on a Thursday afternoon. I drove out to the ridge to think, parked my truck, and sat on the tailgate with a thermos of coffee, watching the light go gold on the tree canopy. The Douglas firs up there are 200 years old in places, thick as grain silos, their bark a deep reddish brown that radiates warmth even in October. I leaned my back against one and felt it like a handshake from every generation that came before me. Then I drove back down and called Clifton Oaks. Clifton was a 71-year-old retired attorney who had spent his entire career in timber and agricultural land law. He had argued cases before the Oregon Court of Appeals. He wore suspenders and a hearing aid and kept 3 decades of case files in his garage and milk crates. He was also my father's oldest friend, and I suspected he had been waiting for exactly this kind of phone call. "Tell me everything," Clifton said when he picked up. So I did. Clifton worked fast for a man with a hearing aid and a garage full of milk crates. Within a week, he had filed a formal response with the Harlan County Zoning Board, citing ORS 215.243, Oregon's Right to Farm and Forest Statute, and attaching my forest management plan, the conservation easement, the forest land classification documents, and a 12-page legal brief that Clifton typed himself on a machine that was genuinely not a computer. He also sent a letter to the HOA's Portland attorney that was 4 pages long and constituted what lawyers sometimes call a come-to-Jesus communication. The zoning board dismissed Vonda's complaint in 2 weeks, didn't even make the agenda. But here's where I made a small mistake. a human one. I told my neighbor Ellis Brewster what was going on. Ellis, who was kind and well-meaning, mentioned it at the Tuesday morning coffee gathering at the Harlan County Diner. 8 or 10 locals who came for the eggs and stayed for the gossip. By Wednesday, half the county knew. Vonda found out I was talking to people, and Vonda, who believed that information was power and that other people's information should be controlled, escalated. She went to the HOA's attorney and requested a cease and desist letter, claiming I was illegally sharing confidential HOA proceeding information, and that doing so constituted defamation. The attorney, who billed by the hour, obliged. I received the letter on a Friday afternoon. I handed it to Clifton, who laughed hard enough that his hearing aid whistled. Here's why. HOA meeting notices, CC and R documents, fine invoices, and compliance letters sent to a property owner are not confidential. They are not proprietary. Sharing them with a neighbor, a cousin, or a reporter is not defamation. Defamation requires a false statement of fact, and everything I had shared was either a true statement or a copy of an actual document. Cease and desist letters, despite their intimidating format, are not court orders. You don't have to comply. You don't even have to respond. A cease and desist letter is a legal threat, not a legal obligation. Without a court order behind it, it has no enforcement power. But the cease and desist did something Vonda probably didn't intend. It made me angry in a productive way. Up until that point, I had been playing defense, responding, deflecting, filing counter notices. That letter was the moment I decided to start playing offense. I drove to the county courthouse and spent a full afternoon in the records room. I pulled the Cascade Ridge HOA's Articles of Incorporation. I pulled the plat filing. I pulled Dwight Pruitt's Development LLC, Pruitt Holdings Oregon, LLC, and its operating agreement. I pulled the recorded deed for the 38 acres Pruitt had bought from old Walt Hennessy. And in that deed, document number 2021-04782 in the Harlan County Recorder's Office, available to any member of the public for a $15 copy fee, I found something. A restriction. When Walt sold the land, he had insisted on one condition. Walt was 91 and not particularly sharp about most things anymore, but he had grown up on that land, and he had one non-negotiable, a strip of old oak trees along the eastern edge. A stand his grandfather had planted in the 1930s as a windbreak could not be disturbed. Pruitt had agreed. It was written right there in black and white. Seller reserves a restrictive covenant protecting the existing oak stand along the eastern boundary, approximately 1.2 acres, from clearing, grading, or development in perpetuity. I drove out to the subdivision's eastern boundary and stood at my fence line looking across at the development. Every single oak tree was gone, cleared for a playground and a mailbox kiosk, fresh concrete pad, raw soil, nothing but stumps. Dwight Pruitt had violated the deed restriction he personally signed. I drove home, put the photographs on the kitchen table, poured myself a drink. Then I called Clifton, and after that I called Ellis. And after that, I sat down and started making a list of everyone in the county who had their own reason to be interested in what Dwight Pruitt was doing out there on the edge of the Timber Hills. The list had 23 names on it by midnight. The oak trees were just the beginning. Once Clifton had the Pruitt Holdings LLC documents in hand, he did what good attorneys do. He started pulling threads. And what he found, over the following 3 weeks, was a sweater that unraveled fast. First, Pruitt Holdings Oregon had taken a construction loan from a regional bank to finance the Cascade Ridge development. That loan had a covenant requiring Pruitt to obtain approval from the lien holder before encumbering any property in the project with new legal restrictions. The HOA's CC&Rs, including the Adjacent Property Jurisdiction Clause, constituted a new legal restriction on the lots. Pruitt had not obtained the bank's approval. The bank, it turned out, was not pleased to learn this. An HOA with questionable jurisdictional claims was an HOA that could generate litigation, and litigation was exactly what a bank holding a $4.2 million construction note did not want to hear about. Second, the Cascade Ridge HOA, per its own Articles of Incorporation, was required to hold annual elections for board members. The HOA was 14 months old. No elections had ever been held. Vonda had appointed herself president, appointed Rutherford and Page as co-directors, and had run the whole operation as a private club. Under Oregon HOA law, ORS 94.625, this made the board's authority procedurally voidable. Every fine levied, every citation issued, every cease and desist letter sent, all of it potentially invalidated because the board issuing those actions had never been properly elected. Third, and this was the one that made Clifton set down his coffee and pick it up again, the CC&R document containing the adjacent property jurisdiction clause had been notarized, but the notary's stamp was from a notary in Multnomah County whose commission had expired 6 weeks before the document was signed. Under Oregon law, a document notarized by a person with an expired commission is defective, not automatically void in every case, but defective. And in a document trying to extend HOA jurisdiction over a neighboring timber operation, defective was going to be a very useful word. Here is the lesson buried in all that legalese. When someone tries to use a legal document to take authority over your property, your first question should not be, how do I fight this? Your first question should be, is this document actually valid? People who draft aggressive legal maneuvers quickly are often people who are sloppy, and sloppiness leaves tracks. Pull the public records. Check the notarization. Check whether required procedural steps, like elections or lender approval, were followed. I sat across from Clifton at his kitchen table, coffee and old paper smell hanging in the air, looking at the list of defects laid out in front of me. The construction loan violation, the election failure, the notary defect, the deed restriction violation on the oak trees, the cease and desist based on a false premise, the zoning complaint, dismissed. It wasn't just a defense anymore, it was a case. Can we take the whole board down? I asked. Clifton picked up his coffee. Son, he said, I think they've done most of the work for us. What we started building that evening wasn't a plan for courtrooms. Courtrooms take years. What Clifton and I designed together was something more efficient, more public, and considerably more satisfying. We were going to force a properly noticed, legally compliant HOA membership meeting with every homeowner, with the bank's representative, with the county, and with everyone Dwight Pruitt had ever lied to. I didn't think of it as a plan. I thought of it as timber work. You don't fell a 200-year-old fir by running at it with a chainsaw. You study the lean. You clear the brush. You notch the base just right so when it goes exactly where you want it. The first move was invoking a specific provision of Oregon HOA law. Under ORS 94.6304, if 20% of the HOA's membership submits a written petition requesting a special membership meeting, the board is legally required to hold one within 30 days. Cascade Ridge had 41 lots. 20% was 9 homeowners. I had 23 names on my list, and Ellis Brewster turned out to personally know 6 Cascade Ridge homeowners who had quietly started to feel that Vonda's board was running things like a personal fiefdom. Within 2 weeks, Ellis had collected 11 signed petitions from Cascade Ridge homeowners. Clifton filed them with the HOA's registered agent via certified mail with return receipt. The 30-day clock started ticking, but petitioning for a meeting was only the first cut, the notch. Clifton contacted the bank holding Pruitt's construction loan, not to threaten, simply to inform. He sent a polite letter, with attached documents, advising the bank that the CC&R filing may have violated the loan's covenant, and that the bank might want its legal department to review the matter before the upcoming HOA membership meeting. Banks are not known for their love of surprises. Within a week, the bank's attorney called Clifton back and indicated that yes, they would send a representative. Meanwhile, I did something that cost nothing but time. I went to see Walt Hennessy. Walt was 91, still sharp enough to be angry, living in an assisted living facility in town, where the hallways smelled of industrial cleaner and microwave dinners. I brought him a thermos of coffee from the diner and a manila envelope of photographs. Walt looked at the photographs of the oak stumps, the trees his grandfather had planted, the windbreak that had stood for 90 years, and his jaw went tight. He took them all, Walt said. Every one, I confirmed. Walt didn't have a lawyer. He did after that afternoon. Clifton's colleague, Frederica Lund, 12 years in agricultural and land rights work, took the deed restriction violation case for Walt on contingency. Because deed restriction violations are civil claims with clear monetary damages, And because the violation was photographically documented and unambiguous, Frederica considered it about as close to a sure thing as the law ever offers. Third move. My friend Dale, who ran the Harlan County Beacon, the county's weekly paper, was made aware, entirely through public records and public documents, of the story developing at the edge of the Timber Hills. Dale pulled the HOA filings himself. He confirmed the notary defect independently. He reached out to 4 Cascade Ridge homeowners for comment. He filed a records request with the county on the zoning complaint dismissal. His story was already written. It would run the morning after the meeting. Fourth move, the one that makes the whole trap snap shut. Clifton drafted a formal petition to the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services, which oversees HOA compliance in the state. The petition documented the failure to hold required annual elections, the defective notarization, and the unauthorized extension of jurisdiction over non-member property. DCBS investigations are not fast, but they are formal, they are documented, and their existence makes attorneys very nervous. The moment a state agency opens a file with your HOA's name on it, the liability conversation changes completely. Oregon HOA law gives members specific procedural rights, including the right to force special meetings and the right to petition state regulators. These are matters of public record. Use them. I spent the last week before the meeting doing what I'd always done, running the timber operation, running the chainsaw, coming home with sawdust in my collar. The ridge was in its late October coat, the firs dark against a white sky, the air carrying the first real edge of cold. I stood at the fence line one evening and looked across at Cascade Ridge. The identical roof lines, the enforced uniformity, the empty playground sitting where Walt's Oaks used to stand. I thought about the meeting. I thought about the bank representative and the DCBS petition and Frederica's lawsuit and Dale's story sitting in the queue. And then I went inside, ate dinner, and got a good night's sleep. Because there is nothing more useful before the day you fell the tree than a solid 8 hours. Vonda Pruitt had not survived a decade in Portland real estate without developing a decent nose for trouble. She could feel the wind changing. She didn't know about the DCBS petition. She didn't know about Frederica's lawsuit. That card was being held for the meeting itself. She didn't know exactly what Ellis had been saying to the Cascade Ridge homeowners, but she knew the petition for the special meeting had arrived, and she knew there were 11 homeowners on it who were supposed to be her people. That made her dangerous. Cornered, insecure authority is the worst kind, because it stops pretending and starts acting. Her first move was to send a letter to every Cascade Ridge homeowner offering a community improvement grant, a one-time payment of $500 from the HOA's reserve fund, to any homeowner who agreed in writing to support the current board's management philosophy. This is, in plain legal terms, vote buying. In an HOA context, it is a fiduciary breach. You are spending members' collective money to entrench your own position. But Vonda didn't think of it that way. She thought of it as marketing. 3 homeowners took the money. Most didn't respond. One, a retired school teacher named Gloria Whitfield in Lot 17, sent the letter directly to Ellis, along with a note that said, "Thought you should have this." Ellis forwarded it to Clifton. Clifton put it in the file. The file was getting heavy. Vonda's second move was to go after the Harlan County Beacon. She called Dale directly and told him that if he ran any story related to the HOA dispute before the meeting, the HOA would pursue a defamation claim. Dale, who had been a county newspaper editor for 22 years and had been threatened twice before by people who later regretted it, thanked her politely and said he'd have his attorney review anything she sent. He then called Clifton, who explained that Vonda's threat was baseless. Everything Dale intended to print was either a matter of public record or a documented fact, and that if she filed a defamation claim, it would be immediately subject to Oregon's anti-SLAPP statute. Anti-SLAPP, strategic lawsuit against public participation. Oregon has one of the stronger anti-SLAPP statutes in the country, and anyone threatening a journalist or a citizen with defamation for discussing public HOA records is walking directly into its teeth. The law allows defendants to seek attorney's fees from plaintiffs who file meritless suits designed to suppress public participation. Anti-SLAPP laws protect people who speak about public matters from lawsuits designed to silence them. If someone threatens you with defamation for discussing HOA public records, anti-SLAPP may be your shield, and it can flip the costs back on the person doing the threatening. Vonda's third move was the one that made me shake my head. She hired a private property research firm to document code violations on my property. They spent a day photographing everything from the public road and the fence line, the barn, the equipment shed, a fuel storage tank near the workshop. She then filed a complaint with the Oregon Department of Agriculture alleging improper fuel storage on the Caldwell property. The idea was to create noise, generate counter-investigations, make me spend time responding to government inquiries instead of preparing for the meeting. What Vonda didn't know was that 3 months earlier, as part of my preparation, I had invited an ODA agricultural compliance officer out to the property for a voluntary review. The officer had inspected everything and provided a written compliance letter, date stamped, signed, filed in the binder. When the ODA received Vonda's complaint, they logged it against the existing compliance file and sent me a courtesy notice. I filed it, went back to work, and bought a second binder because the first one was full. 2 inches of documented ammunition, organized by date, printed in triplicate. Vonda was spending money, spending time, and burning every bridge she had, and I was just waiting for the meeting. There was 1 week left before the meeting when Dwight Pruitt called me directly. It was just before 6 in the morning, that particular hour when the light is coming, but hasn't committed yet, and the tree line sits black against a pale gray sky. I was having coffee on the porch, watching the mist come off the creek in slow white curls, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. Caldwell. Pruitt's voice was the voice of a man accustomed to being the biggest personality in every room. Smooth, round, filling space. This is Dwight Pruitt. I think we should talk. I'm listening, I said. He talked about how the whole thing had been a misunderstanding, how the CC and Rs had been drafted quickly, and the adjacent property language had been intended as a good faith effort to maintain community standards, and maybe hadn't been worded as precisely as it should have been. How the HOA would be willing to formally acknowledge that my property was outside its jurisdiction. How the claimed fines, now totaling over $24,000 on paper, would be completely forgiven, because everyone understood they were never truly applicable. How he hoped I could approach the upcoming meeting in a spirit of cooperation. I listened to all of it in silence. Then I said, "Are you aware that the oak stand on your eastern boundary is covered by a deed restriction?" There was a pause. "That's something our attorneys are reviewing." "Because the trees are gone, Dwight. I've got the photographs. Walt Hennessy's attorney has the photographs, and the deed restriction is in the public record." Another pause, longer. "There may have been a miscommunication with our site contractor." "I'm going to the meeting," I said. "I'll see you there." And I hung up. Later that day, a settlement offer arrived via Clifton, a written proposal from Pruitt's attorney offering a formal written release from all HOA claims and a one-time payment of $15,000 in exchange for my agreement not to attend the membership meeting or actively organize opposition to the current board. Clifton read it to me over the phone. There was a long pause. "Does accepting that settlement mean I can't tell the homeowners about the election violations?" I asked. "It would include a non-disparagement clause," Clifton said. "Yes." "And the bank's representative is already coming?" "Already confirmed." "And DCBS has the petition?" "Filed 10 days ago." "And Dale's story runs the morning after regardless." "Sitting in the queue." "And Frederica's lawsuit for Walt?" "Ready to file." I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the top of the Douglas firs, that deep, slow, breathing sigh, like the forest inhaling, that I have been hearing my whole life. The sound of something very large being very still, just before it moves. "Tell them no," I said. Pruitt's attorney called back the next day with $30,000. Clifton said no. The attorney escalated to calling Clifton unreasonable and warning that the Caldwell family should think carefully about the costs of prolonged litigation. Clifton, who had argued cases before the Oregon Court of Appeals in the 1990s, thanked the man for his time and wished him a good evening. That night, I drove the boundary of my property one last time, windows down, elbow out, breathing the October air. The forest smelled like cold and pine, and something older than either, that deep mineral scent of soil that has been building for 2 centuries, that doesn't know about subdivisions or homeowners associations or men in expensive boots. I thought about Elias Caldwell, who came to this ground with nothing but a mule and a willingness to stay. I thought about what it meant to hold a thing through patience. I went home and packed the binders, both of them. I organized every document by date. I printed 3 copies of everything, one for me, one for Clifton, and one for the room. There is a specific satisfaction in preparation that only people who have spent a long time working outdoors fully understand. The satisfaction of knowing you have done everything the right way, in the right order, and that when the moment comes, all you have to do is stand there. The moment was 1 week away. The special membership meeting of Cascade Ridge Estates HOA was held on a Tuesday evening in November, 6:30 p.m., in the subdivision's clubhouse. It was full. I had expected maybe 20 people. There were 46. Every lot owner was there or represented. Ellis Brewster stood against the back wall in his feed store vest, next to Dale from the Beacon with a notepad in his hand. A woman in a gray blazer near the back turned out to be the bank's loan compliance officer. A man with a State of Oregon lanyard was from DCBS. And in the front row, in a folding chair, sat Walt Hennessy, 91 years old, jaw set, next to Frederica Lund, whose lawsuit had been filed that afternoon and was already in the county clerk's system. Vonda sat at the folding table at the front of the room in a blazer the color of a fire hydrant, flanked by Rutherford and Page. She looked at the room. She looked at the woman in gray. She looked at the DCBS lanyard. Her smile was doing something complicated. Clifton opened proceedings. He was 71 years old, with suspenders and a hearing aid, and more presence than most people half his age. When he stood up and said, quietly, without dramatics, "I'd like to begin by noting that this board has never held a legally required annual election under ORS 94.625, and therefore its authority to issue fines, assessments, or any other enforceable action is procedurally void." The room went very quiet. He noted the defective notarization on the CC&R document. He produced the certified mail receipt, confirming Pruitt had received notice of the loan covenant issue. He introduced the DCBS representative and explained the pending regulatory investigation. He introduced Frederica and noted the deed restriction lawsuit. Then, calmly, he produced a single-page summary of the 11 separate grounds on which the HOA's claimed $24,000 fine against me was legally unenforceable, and invited the board to provide documentation to the contrary. Rutherford said, "I think we should pause and—" "Rutherford," said a large man named Gordon from Lot 22, "did you know there hadn't been any elections?" Rutherford's mouth closed. Paige looked at her phone. When someone at a governance meeting looks at their phone, they are either texting their attorney or looking for an exit, frequently both. The bank's representative rose and stated, in the careful language of someone thoroughly briefed, that the bank was actively reviewing the loan covenant implications of the CC&R filing and expected to be kept apprised of any material changes to the HOA's governance structure. In bank speak, you violated the loan covenant, we are watching you, and your construction loan is now a very different conversation. Then I stood up. I didn't use notes. I had memorized what I wanted to say because some things you should know by heart. "I'm a 5th-generation timberman," I said. "My family has been on that land since before any of your streets were paved. I didn't ask for any of this. I got a letter telling me my trees were out of compliance. My trees." I let that sit for a moment. I have not threatened anyone. I have not sued anyone. I have not sent a cease and desist letter to a newspaper. Everything I've done has been a matter of public record, and everything this board has done is now also a matter of public record. I looked directly at Vonda. I want those fines removed from any record. I want a written acknowledgement that my property is outside HOA jurisdiction, and I want this board to hold an election, tonight, or within 30 days as required by law. Those are the only 3 things I'm asking for. The room was very quiet. Then Gloria Whitfield from Lot 17, the retired schoolteacher who had sent me Vonda's vote-buying letter, raised her hand. "I move that the board resign and that we hold immediate elections." Someone seconded it before she'd finished the sentence. The vote was 31-3. Vonda's blazer seemed to deflate. Rutherford stared at the table. Paige resigned by text, to the room's WhatsApp group, while still sitting in her chair, which was the most passive-aggressive thing anyone had ever witnessed at a governance meeting in Harlan County. Vonda resigned. Rutherford resigned. A new 3-member interim board was elected on the spot. Gordon from Lot 22, Gloria from Lot 17, and Walt Hennessy, 91 years old in his folding chair, who got a standing ovation that rattled the new carpet-smelling walls of that beige clubhouse. The meeting was over in under 2 hours. Outside, someone had built a fire in a barrel in the parking lot. Wood smoke drifted through the cold November air, that particular smell of burning that means something old is being cleared away to make room for something that can last. I stood there and let it warm my face. 140 years on this land, and it was still mine. What happened after the meeting happened fast, and then slowly, and both were satisfying in different ways. The fast part. The interim board met the following week and voted to formally acknowledge in writing that the Caldwell Timber Tract was outside the jurisdiction of Cascade Ridge Estates HOA. They struck every fine, every citation, every enforcement notice from the record. They notified the Secretary of State's office of the board transitions and scheduled the first ever proper annual election for 60 days out. New CC and RS, drafted by a different attorney, without any creative adjacent property jurisdiction language, were adopted unanimously. Dwight Pruitt's deed restriction lawsuit didn't go to trial. Frederica filed on behalf of Walt Hennessy, and within 6 weeks, Pruitt's attorney reached out seeking a settlement conference. The settlement was confidential, but it produced a very satisfied look on Frederica's face when she called me to report. It included a remediation agreement requiring Pruitt to fund the replanting of the oak stand, 60 new trees, native white oak, planted by a local restoration nursery, along the eastern boundary of what used to be Walt's land. The bank's review of the loan covenant issue resulted in a required audit of Pruitt Holdings Oregon, LLC. That audit produced findings that apparently required Pruitt's personal attention for quite some time. The DCBS investigation closed with a formal finding and a compliance order requiring the new board to maintain proper election records, meeting minutes, and assessment transparency going forward. It is part of the permanent public record. Dale's story ran in the Harlan County Beacon the morning after the meeting. It was picked up by a regional news aggregator. I got calls from 3 other timber landowners in 2 adjacent counties who had received similar HOA jurisdiction letters from different developers. Clifton handled all 3. He started billing again for the first time in 4 years, and seemed happier about it than the money. Now for the slow part, the part that matters most. In the spring, the new Cascade Ridge HOA board voted to establish what they called the Caldwell-Hennessy Timber Heritage Fund. Every year, 5% of HOA dues would go towards supporting sustainable forestry education for high school students in Harlan County. The first year, it provided 2 $1,500 scholarships to graduating seniors going into forestry or environmental science programs. Walt Hennessy died the following August in the assisted living facility in town, with the signed copy of the oak replanting agreement on the nightstand next to his bed. He was 92. His kids scattered his ashes at the edge of his old property, near the first row of newly planted oaks, just starting to push their second season of leaves. I got a letter from the Oregon Department of Forestry that year, commending my conservation easement management and inviting me to speak at a land stewardship conference in Corvallis. I went. I talked for 12 minutes, which was about 11 minutes longer than I'd planned, and the room gave me a standing ovation. I still wake up at 5. I still make coffee. I still go out to the porch and watch the mist come off the creek and the ridgeline, and the 200-year-old Douglas firs standing in the early light like everything that endures, because it was built right and left alone to do its work. The barn still leans a little to the east. I'm in no hurry to fix it. So that's what happens when you send a certified letter to the wrong man. When you mistake patience for weakness. When you try to put a fence around someone else's 140 years. You end up in a county meeting room watching your board resign by text while a 91-year-old man gets a standing ovation.